Hello again, and thank you again for being with us. My name is Reem Turkmani, and I'm chairing this event today. I am the principal investigator of the research project Citizenship and Legitimacy in the Arab World. Our research is based at the LSE, and it's funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. This event today is a part of actually 6-month celebration that we are starting today. So this is our first event in a series of events that will come through the coming 6 months. The celebration was meant to be a conference, but due to the COVID reality now, we have to convert to the virtual world. Our celebration is actually called Celebrating the Centenary of State-Building Attempts in the Levant, reflecting on the historic backgrounds of contemporary issues. Let me tell you a little bit about this and why we started this celebration before we go into our event. Exactly 100 years later, the first ever attempt to write a contemporary constitution for a modern state in the entire area that is now referred to as the Middle East have started. Around that time, it's exactly, again, a century ago, exactly around middle of July, the Pan-Syria Congress, or also known as the Syrian Arab Congress, in Arabic it's Al-Mu'tamar Al-Suri Al-Am, was elected. Actually, it was already elected back in 2019 to achieve two main tasks. The first one was to report to the King Craig Committee, and the second one to write a constitution for Syria, which back then included not just modern-day Syria, but also Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon. Around this time, a century ago, they finished deliberating all the articles of the Constitution, and they started voting on the Articles of 21. Now, the French army then stormed in Damascus on 24th of July, and it put an end to all this attempt, which came, of course, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Now, with that came the fragmentation of the area into different states after different mandates, and each state followed a different constitutional trajectory. In Syria, however, there was another attempt to write a constitution by an elected assembly in 1928. But after months and months of deliberation and reaching a very progressive constitution, the French came into the last meetings and they just completely rejected everything that was achieved based on the idea that it's us, the French, who rules now. We have the sovereignty. You cannot have a constitution that gives Syria a sovereignty. So they objected, for against 6 or 7 articles in the constitutions. They simply rejected any compromise and said, you either take it as a package or not. So that sadly was not enacted. 2 years later, France enacted its own constitution with a modification of the 1928 constitution. And then it wasn't really until the 1950 until another elected assembly was able to convene and deliberate and enact a new constitution for Syria, for independent Syria this time. But now that the Syrians have started losing their unity against a common enemy, which they had before the independence. So although they did agree on a constitution in 1950, and it was enacted, it wasn't long after, only 3 years after, until a military coup took over and it's imposed a new constitution. After that, we had 7 constitutions enforced in Syria, top down, either military coup or committees basically established at the top. And this is not only in Syria. I mean, until today, neither in the history of Jordan, nor Lebanon, nor Palestine was any constitution ever written by a representative elected assembly. The only exception was the 1950 constitution in Syria, which only governed for a limited number of years. So today, 100 years later, we look at the Middle East, we see protests everywhere, they go up and down, but they just never seem to settle. Lots of contempt of the system of governance and those who are governing the area, conflicts everywhere, lots of unresolved issues, including the issue of where does the religion sit in the state, the independence of the judiciary, the women's right, the distribution of public wealth, confessional identity, sectarianism. All these issues are still driving the area today. They are the very, very same issues that they were deliberated 100 years ago. And we fail not to notice this and not to ask the question, are these issues ever going to be resolved until the region produce its own set of constitution, of mutually agreed text on how to be governed, its own vision of a state that reflects the vision of its own people? We think until that is done, until there is a bottom-up legitimate state-building process, there will never be real peace in the entire Middle East. There will always be conflict that keep coming up again and again. Within that context, we are looking at the contemporary issue, but with a reflection at this historic failure and its reasons. And within this context, we asked Professor Elizabeth Thompson to be our first speaker on this, because she touches on one of the most important topics here, which is really the relationship between the state and the religion. And this is a topic we also, myself and Dr. Brahim Deraji, who's my colleague in this project, wrote a working paper on, called The Question of Religion and the Syrian Constitution. And we reflected that what happened through the last 100 years and the contemporary issues. So let me now introduce Professor Thompson, who is a professor of history and the Mohammed Saeed Farsi Chair of Islamic Peace at the American University in Washington, D.C. Her research is on the history of democratic struggle in the Middle East since the early 20th century, with a special interest in how gender, race, and forced intervention have shaped the popular movement. She has won many prestigious awards, including from the Carnegie Corporation, which is, again, the sponsor of our research project. Professor Thompson, before giving you the floor, let me congratulate you on a wonderful book that couldn't be more timely, not only because the scholarly achievement, not only because the amazing knowledge that unraveled in this book, but also because we as Syrians, we need this. It's exactly the right time we need now to reconnect with our past. As I said, all this contemporary debates now about who are we as Syrians and what kind of state we want, we were never aware that these were the same discussions that started 100 years ago. The history that we were taught in schools and history books all focus on the military struggle against the occupation. So, for example, the Battle of Maysalun was a very big thing, but little we know about the political movement, the civil society movement, all these wonderful debates that were going on, especially on the relationship between the state and the religion. So it's very timely, we need it, and thank you very much for a real page-turner book. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you all for inviting me to speak today. I'm so pleased that the book is so untimely, and that we face a period of pandemic. And I'm sorry I can't be physically there with you in London, but I'm delighted to share a bit of a slideshow with you on major themes of my book. And then I hope we'll have a nice conversation afterwards. Let's see if I can get my slideshow going now. Perfect. All right. To begin, I think we must remember that today, as we meet, some half of the Syrian people are starving. Millions go to bed every night with no food in their stomachs, and many with no roof over their heads. Is it a luxury to speak of democracy during pandemic and famine? I believe not. As the economist Amartya Sen has argued, famines mainly occur under dictatorships, not under democracies. It is therefore imperative that we examine why Syria has lost its democratic culture, and only then might we imagine how to restore it. My book concerns the period following another pandemic 100 years ago, the Spanish flu. After 4 years of World War I and food shortages and disease and hunger, Syria too was hit by that flu. Some 500,000 people, 500,000 in greater Syria, died in that period. And it was in that moment that political leaders gathered in Damascus to build a new state that would protect the welfare of the people better than the Ottoman Turks had done. Let me say a couple words about the origin of the project, how and why I decided to write the book. I think it helps give you the larger picture of the book's themes. In the summer of 2013, I was writing an article on Syria after the First World War. Two things struck me. First, I was surprised to discover that the president of the Syrian Congress in 1920 was a religious man, Sheikh Rashid Rida. He led the drafting of a constitution that is, for me, as a historian, the most democratic in the Arab world through to the present day, in which religion was separated from the state. And yet he called it an Islamically inspired state. The second thing that struck me that summer was to see the end of the Arab Spring in Egypt with the massacre of 400 Muslim brothers. In 2011, the democratic revolution against Hosni Mubarak's dictatorship had begun with the union of secular liberals and the Muslim Brothers. But in 2013, the liberals turned against the president-elect, Mohamed Morsi, and the Muslim Brotherhood, because they had rammed through a very different kind of constitution, which very narrowly based the Egyptian government on Islamic law. Instead, secular liberals in Egypt supported the coup by General Sisi, who has now installed a harsher dictatorship than before. How is it that the coalition between liberals and Islamists was successful in 1920, but that the same coalition failed a century later? I wrote this book to explain the success and, as importantly, the destruction of the Democratic Coalition in 1920. I believe that the history of this time is an important factor in the current weakness of democracy in the Arab world. A little bit of historical background. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War presented a chance to build an independent Arab state. It was built and envisioned not only by Syrian nationalists within Balad al-Sham, and here particularly in Damascus, but also amongst Arabs down in the Hijaz and the Arabian Peninsula, who feared that a defeat of the Ottoman Empire would lead to their colonization by Europe. So the motive to build an Arab state came from the desire for independence and sovereignty. In October 1918, Prince Faisal proclaimed this state to govern the territory of Greater Syria, which includes, as you can see a bit on the map, this is an Ottoman map, but it includes today's Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. Faisal also proclaimed that the state should be a constitutional monarchy where all Arabs, Muslim or not, would enjoy equal rights. Faisal demanded recognition of this Arab state at Paris in a meeting with the Supreme Council of the Peace Conference. His speech so impressed Woodrow Wilson that the American president actively defended Syrians' right to self-determination against British and French claims to Syria in their secret Sykes-Picot Treaty. In February 1919, Wilson presented the Covenant of the New League of Nations to the world. Article 22 of the covenant guaranteed recognition of a provisional independence for Syria under what was to be a temporary mandate. Afterwards, Wilson sent an American commission of inquiry to survey Syrians on their preferences concerning that mandate. In Syria, after Faisal returned there in May of 1919, elections were held for a representative Congress. As you can see on this poster, we see here's Rashid Rida as a member. He was a representative from Tripoli on the Lebanese coast. And you'll see that he's wearing a turban as a man of religion, as were several deputies in the Congress. He was not yet president of the Congress in March 1920. The president at that time was this man, Hashim Atassi, who came from Homs. He was a lawyer and a former bureaucrat in the Ottoman Empire, well-schooled in governance. He wears, as you can see, a tarbouch. And like many in the Congress, who were also professionals and former Ottoman bureaucrats. We also see on this poster, it's a useful historical piece of evidence, a document. We see that there were some members who wore scarves. They were tribal leaders from the countryside. And there were others who wore no hat at all. They tended to come from Fatah, the nationalist group started by college-age youth right before the war, and who were very much active in trying to establish an independent Syria. What this poster shows us as a kind of historical source for us is that the Syrian Arab Congress was not a theater of puppets controlled either by Faisal, pictured here, or by Fatah, as the French colonialists claimed. They would dismiss the Congress as not truly representative, a kind of window dressing for the world, right? In fact, as I found in my research, the Congress represented many different interests in Syrian society: rural and urban, conservative and reformist, religious and secular. In the summer of 1919, the Congress met with the American King Crane Commission sent by President Wilson. The deputies demanded, first of all, full independence. But if Paris would not accept that, the deputies said they preferred a minimalist American mandate consisting of a very brief period of guidance by advisors who would be chosen by the Syrians themselves. In any case, the Congress refused a French mandate because they knew that France intended to colonize Syria. However, in Washington later in 1919, the United States Senate voted to refuse ratification of the Treaty of Versailles and therefore entry into the League of Nations. There could be no American mandate. Abandoned by the Americans, the Congress declared independence of Syria in March 1920 without recourse to the peace conference in Paris. They argued that the covenant of the League of Nations had already granted them provisional independence, and they did not need the approval of Paris to do so. Immediately following the March 8th Declaration of Independence, Congress began to draft a Syrian constitution. The deputies gathered in this building in the central square of Damascus from the end of March to the middle of July in 1920. In my opinion, the constitution that they drafted in these months was a true political contract between representatives of the people, much like the American Constitution that was drafted by the American Constitutional Congress at Philadelphia in 1787. The Congress voted to accept a full draft of the Constitution on July 5th, 1920. By July 19th, the deputies had formally ratified the first 6 of the 147 articles. Article 1 of the Constitution established a civil regime in the form of a representative monarchy with the capital at Damascus. Article 1 also established Islam as the religion of the king. This, by the way, remains in modified form a requirement has remained a requirement in Syrian constitutions ever since, although in 1928, beginning then, the term king was changed to president. But let us pause for a moment on the language used in 1920. Only after reading the other articles of the Constitution can we understand fully the importance of this language in Article 1. The article does not establish Islam as the religion of the state, as it had been under the Ottomans. Thus, 8 years before, the secular anti-religion Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, president of the new Republic of Turkey, established Islam. He did so in 1928. The Syrians had disestablished Islam in 1920. While the king of Syria was to be Muslim, he did not swear to uphold Islamic law. Article 6 of the Constitution, also fully ratified, required the king to, quote, swear before the Congress an oath of respect for divine laws and of loyalty to the nation and adherence to the Constitution. No article in the 1920 Constitution requires that legislation be based on Islamic law, contrary to most Arab constitutions today. Even more surprising to me is that the Congress disestablished Islam under the presidency of this famous Muslim sheikh, Rashid Rida, who published an Islamic magazine called Amanar, the Lighthouse, read by Muslims from Morocco to Indonesia. Why? In an article that he wrote later, Rida explained that equality is a fundamental principle of Islamic governance. To make Islam the foundation of government in Syria, therefore, would violate that principle, because up to 1/5 of the population was not Muslim, and even amongst Muslims, there were different sects. Since all citizens would not be equal, if the Constitution were based on Islamic law, the Constitution would therefore paradoxically violate the principles of Islamic governance. Rida also explained that religious law should be limited to religious matters and not extended to all matters of public interest. That is another difference from most Islamist programs today, which claim that Islamic law should cover all matters. I further discovered that Rida played a key role in negotiating the compromise language that we find in Article 1. He had to barter between religious conservatives in 1920, who, like many today, preferred Islam to be the state religion, and secular liberals, particularly those young men in Fatah, who preferred to separate religion and state. Under the compromise that Rida brokered, then the two parties agreed, okay, the state would not be Muslim, but the king should be. Rida agreed with the conservatives that many people in Syria at the time were used to the idea that their supreme leader should be also a spiritual leader. They had, after all, in Syria, lived under Ottoman rule, and therefore the umbrella, the rule of the Ottoman Caliph for 400 years. And so many argued it would be an abrupt change, and Rida warned them that not requiring that there be a Muslim king might lead to a revolt against what conservatives and religiously minded people might consider an infidel state. The democratic spirit of the Constitution was further expressed in the Constitution in articles that contained a comprehensive list of what we would consider today democratic rights: the freedom of to belief and speech, freedom of assembly, the right to privacy and to secure property rights, the freedom and the right to a free public education. The Constitution also ensured that government would run as a democracy. Sovereignty lay with the people. Congress, the Constitution shows, elected Faisal as Syria's first king. Faisal did not rule by dynastic or divine right. Furthermore, the prime minister was responsible to the Congress, not to the king. That differed from the Ottoman Constitution. And finally, the right to vote was extended to all Syrians aged 20 or older. The article on suffrage, article number 78, caused the most explosive debate in the Congress. And I'll pause to talk about it now. In late April 1920, a group of women led by Nazak al-Abed of Damascus and Anbar Salem of Beirut petitioned the Congress to grant educated women the right to vote. They pointed to the fact that British women who had also, like them, served and helped their people during the wartime had just won the vote, and that the right to vote in the United States for women was at that time being ratified. According to Congress Secretary Izzat Darwazeh, also pictured on your slide, a majority of deputies in the Congress actually supported the women. They claimed that Islam demanded equality among all believers, and therefore women should have the equal right to vote. However, the opposition, the conservative opposition in Congress, claimed that Islam prohibited women's vote because women under Islam had no independent conscience and were required to obey their husbands and their fathers. 6 deputies, all religious conservatives, stormed out of the chamber in anger and in defiance of the dominant sentiment that women should have the vote. The Congress was in danger not only of splitting, but of dissolving. Sheikh Rashid Rida stood up to great applause at this critical moment and proposed another compromise. He argued that both sides were wrong. Women's suffrage had nothing to do with Islam. It was a matter of secular public interest, not religious requirements. However, he then argued, public interest in April 1920 demand that they postpone a decision on women's rights, given the vociferous opposition by a minority. France, he noted, was just then building an army on the Lebanese coast and threatened invasion of Syria in the hinterland. The most important interest, Rida argued, was to remain united against this common threat. Congress agreed and postponed the decision on women's vote. However, if you read in the Arabic original, Article 78, the language simply says Syrians of age 20 or more have the right to vote, leaving it open to further later modification. 1 week after Rida's intervention in the suffrage debate, he was elected president of the Congress. Meanwhile, the European leaders of the Paris Peace Conference rejected the independence of Syria, rejected the authority of the Congress, and also rejected the choice of Faisal as king. The Supreme Council of the conference consequently met at the end of April, just as the suffrage debate was going on, at San Remo, on the border between Italy and France, in order to divide Greater Syria into mandates. We can see on the slide who was present. Here is Alexandre Millerand, the Premier of France, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, the Prime Minister of Italy, and here's the delegate of Japan. Where, you might ask, are the Arabs? There was, in fact, a Hijaz delegation, an Arab delegation admitted to the conference at large. But their delegates were excluded from this conference. As far as I can tell from the memoirs of Rustam Haidar and mention from other sources, they may well have been standing here on the other side of the door as the decision was made on mandates and the division of Syria. In that room, in a luxury hotel in San Remo, Greater Syria was divided between the British and the French. France would get a mandate over the northern half, today's Syria and Lebanon, and Britain would govern the southern half, today's Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. In addition, Iraq would go to the British on the understanding that the British would share Iraqi oil with the French. I argue in the book that it was the British desire for oil that propelled it to demand and take and occupy large stretches of territory in the Arab provinces of the former defeated Ottoman Empire. And it was this aggression that provoked France, mainly in reaction to Britain's land grab, to demand Syria against the wishes of Syrians. The report that King and Crane had written 9 months earlier, demonstrating the large number of petitions from Syrians from many different countries, different cities, in lands that are now divided amongst Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan, that they all demanded independence, had been put in a drawer and quietly suppressed. Immediately after San Remo, French Prime Minister Alexandre Millerand began planning for the military occupation of the Syrian interior and the Arab capital of Damascus. Back in 1919, we must remember, the original League covenant announced by Wilson and later ratified by the French and the British. In writing that covenant, it was imagined by these very same leaders that the mandatory powers would be invited by the people of the country out of their own free choice. In fact, however, in 1920, the mandates in the Arab world were imposed at gunpoint. Mitterrand justified the French armed invasion by claiming that the Congress was illegal and that its demands for independence and democratic government were, quote unquote, extremist. The Syrian army at that time, that summer of 1920, was still very weak. Why? Because France and Britain had prohibited the import and purchase of arms. As a result, the Syrian army was quickly defeated at Maysalun, just outside of Damascus, during the morning hours of July 24th, 1920. There are many who will observe the 100th anniversary of that battle next week. In Damascus, most of the Congress deputies jumped on trains, cars, carriages, and fled to Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, and Iraq, even the Arabian Peninsula, down to the Hejaz. Faisal himself sought exile in Italy, the one European power at Paris that had shown any sympathy for Arab demands for independence. The French invasion ended democratic politics in Syria. By establishing their mandates by force, France and Britain laid the foundations for dictatorship in the Eastern Arab world after World War I. In conclusion, I'd like to say or give a few examples to show how difficult it was to retrieve or revive the democratic coalition built in 1920 in what historians we would call a conjuncture, the combining of several different circumstances. 1920, in retrospect, was an opportunity that would come and go. It gave Syrians a common enemy, which encouraged them to unite, but it also had produced a Congress with an eminent personality like Rida, who could forge bargains amongst the different factions who might otherwise have fallen apart in division and never written a constitution. Right? Indeed, in the 1920s, it was very difficult to replicate what happened in the spring of 1920 at Damascus. Here we have Faisal in Iraq, in Baghdad. The British felt bad about breaking their promise of independence to Faisal and his father. In reality, as many historians, not just myself, have shown, the oil deal was far more important to them than honoring their promise. But as a consolation prize, they crowned Faisal king of Iraq in 1921. Faisal blamed the fall of Syria on the Congress. He was therefore content to govern Iraq in an undemocratic manner with a weak parliament. Exiled in Egypt, Rashid Rida turned against his former liberal allies. He did so, though, only after traveling to Geneva to make an appeal to the League of Nations in the summer of 1921, at the same time that Faisal was being crowned. And I'd like to read to you just a quote from what he said to the head of the League of Nations Assembly when he met him that summer. Quote, "It does not befit the honor of this league, which President Wilson proposed to include all civilized nations for the good of all human beings, nor the honor of its member nations and governments, nor the honor of its principles and goals, for it to be used as a tool by the two colonial states. These states," he means Britain and France, "seek to use this assembly of the League to guarantee in the name of a mandate the subjugation of peoples." Rida continued and warned the League, presciently, correctly, as we know in retrospect, that world peace and the future of international law were at stake. He said, quote, "If the Balkans were the spark of war in the West in 1914, sparking World War I, that is, then Syria, Palestine, and other Arab countries will ignite the fires of war in both the West and East if the League continues to uphold a mandate fraudulently imposed on Syria." Well, the League did not. In 1922, it voted to ratify that mandate and uphold it. Rida, therefore, began teaching his students back in Cairo and the readers of his magazine Manar to seek justice within Islam, not at Geneva and through the League of Nations. Indeed, justice must be found against the promises and illusions of the West. One of his students, Hassan al-Banna, founded the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 in much that same spirit, seeing the justice of Islam as not compatible with what he saw as the Europeans' liberalism. Liberalism in 1920 was still considered by Muslims and all those readers of Rida's magazine as a universal ideal that all civilizations, whether it be Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, and so on, could adhere to. By the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, liberalism had become a set of values that belonged to Europe only, and that Europe used fraudulently to subjugate other countries by calling them non-liberal and uncivilized, and therefore deserving of colonization. So in that context in 1928, Banna, in articulating the political program of the Muslim Brotherhood, conflated his talk of a constitution with his appeal for government based on Islamic law only. That is the opposite of the position that Rashid Rida held back in 1920. In Syria under the French, the 1920 Islamo-liberal coalition disappeared. Secular elites eventually formed the National Bloc in opposition to the new populist Islamic parties. Hashim Atassi, who was the first president of the 1920 Congress now became the bloc's prime minister in 1936, as you can see in the photo. Atassi confronted the opposition of leaders like Kamal el-Qassab, who headed up an association of ulama in Damascus in the late 1930s. Qassab had actually been one of the Islamic leaders who had rallied to the cause of independence and to the Congress in 1920. Whereas he was once an ally of Atassi, he was now Atassi's political rival. And in 1939, he and other Islamist leaders staged demonstrations that brought down the National Bloc government on the eve of World War II. The destruction of the Arab democratic regime at Damascus in 1920 influenced then the politics in the other mandates in Egypt and in Arabia. Remember that those who experienced and saw the possibility of democracy, but then its failure, who in many ways they had seen their own political standing discredited and undermined by the French, because they had promised that by declaring a constitutional monarchy, they would gain the respect and recognition of other countries of the world, and they were proved wrong. They found it very difficult to build popular democratic parties in Iraq, in Arabia, in Jordan, in Egypt, and in Lebanon, where they fled. Instead, they followed either sort of top-down authoritarian nationalist programs like Faisal. Some of them joined Islamic programs, as Qassab did, and as Rida and Banna formed. Others, like Izzat Darwazeh in Palestine, tried to revive the 1920 coalition. In 1931, he had helped organize a side meeting to an Islamic Congress at Jerusalem that year, and had even invited Faisal to organize a subsequent meeting in Baghdad. The British clamped down on all of those efforts and prevented any such meeting from happening before Faisal died in 1933, however. The cleavage between secular liberals and Islamists deepened in Syria and Egypt and elsewhere after the Second World War and independence. Paradoxically, secular military dictators adopted constitutions which enshrined Islam as the official religion and source of legislation, in opposition to the democratic logic of 1920. The division between liberals and Islamists and the mutual suspicion and distrust that grew between them has ever since continued to weaken opposition to dictatorship in the Arab world. This division, we're missing a picture from Syria on this slideshow, and a nice picture of a demonstration in Banyas. You'll have to imagine it. This division persisted until the 2011 uprisings, and tragically, it reappeared afterward. From a historical point of view, then, in conclusion, the future for democracy in Syria and elsewhere in the Arab world may well depend on repairing this century-old cleavage, which was based, as you have seen here, not on any essential attributes of Islam or essential attributes of democracy, rather on the contingent political choices made by political leaders in the wake of another pandemic in 1920. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Oh, I don't hear you.
Sorry, I was muting myself. So, yeah. Great, thank you very much, Professor Thompson, for a very, very engaging presentation, and indeed very interesting, very timely book, which I invite everyone to read. I have good news for our audience, is that Professor Thompson agreed to share with us a chapter of her book, very relevant to her presentation. The chapter is called A Democratic Constitution for Christians and Muslims. This is chapter 14 of her book, and I just shared with you here in the chat box a link to where you can download this chapter. We are also now in the process of translating this to Arabic. Before I open the floor up for questions and answer, and I would just also like to remind the audience that if you would like to type your question, you can use the chat box on the right-hand side. If you want to speak, you can make a request using the little icon with a hand shape. Before going there, I just want to make a few comments. First, I was really struck by the picture you shared of San Remo conference, like how things not only not changed, they've gone backwards. It's like you said, the Syrians were not in that room. They were on the other side of the room when the future of Syria was being discussed on the table. Right now, it's even much worse. The Syrians are not anywhere, even in the country where the rooms, where all the decisions about the future of Syria are made, completely excluded from the process and only invited in the last minute on even in bases where they're, the top power will pick and choose who to invite and who to send. And indeed, unless this change, again, I doubt Syrians will ever be able to resolve all their issues themselves. The second comment I want to make is on the debate about women's right to vote. You rightly cited the role of the Rida in this discussion, but don't you think also the division wasn't exactly between the liberal and the Muslim, but between the conservatives and the non-conservative in their thinking? For example, their progressive religious leaders like Said Murad, he was so much in favor of women's right to vote that he thought this is even granted by religion itself. On the other side, there were those who came to the Congress as the effendis. They were not wearing turban, right? But they were very backwarded. Some of them were merchants from Damascus, for example. And they actually, for a minute, they thought, hold on, if we actually refer to religion here, we're not going to win our argument. So let's put religion aside and let's go back to our tradition. And their argument was like, religion is a bit too advanced here. We are in a situation where we have to look at our social reality and the fact that most women are not educated. And they claim that, if they were in Europe, they would be in favor of women to right to vote because women there are more educated and so forth. So they suddenly started referring to the society and its tradition rather than the religion. And at the end, when they decided not to settle the issue, actually, they almost granted the women the right to vote because they left it to the language, to the interpretation. Because according to the Arabic language, if you say, kul muwatin Suri, like every Syrian citizen, it could be decided, it could be men or women. So they left this maybe to the.
They did leave it open. You're exactly right. I'm glad you made that clear, that it wasn't a secular religious argument at all, right? That there were conservatives who were not religious who were opposed, and vice versa. There were religious people. But I think that's why it was important to notice Rashid Ridda's own logic, that, there were people using religion for and against the issue. There were going to be people who argued the issue not on the basis of religion at all, right? And so you're right. We should emphasize seeing it from that point of view too.
Okay, so I'm going to use my position as a chair again for two questions for you. One actually came from some of the audience when I put an announcement about the talk, is about the name of the Congress. You call it the Arab Syrian Congress, where the original name doesn't have the word Arab in it. Al-Mu'tamar Suri al-Aam. That's the first question. The second, you rightly pointed out the importance of working on this cleavage of like this the liberal versus Islamists, which is like a century old and need to be resolved. But do you think this is the only main one that we're facing now? Because many of the issues that are driving the region now also have to do about other aspects of democracy, like the separation of power, independence of judiciary, local governance, like decentralization. And remarkably also, the Syrian Congress made incredible achievement here when they insisted on separation of power. And one of the things they did is that they took power from King Faisal, who was the guy who said, who called for the Congress even to be elected. And they surprised him by saying, okay, well, thank you, but we're going to take the power now from you. You are only constitutional monarch. So what other issues do you think are still relevant that were debated back then in 1920?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Those are great questions. Yes, on the name, I labored over that because, in fact, once you get into the primary sources, people are using different names, right? And I knew that in English, it was often known as Syrian Arab. And I think the translation of the book, I'm going to rethink the usage. I wanted to make it recognizable to English readers, to what I was speaking about, but also saying Syrian Arab, I see the difficulty there. On one hand, for an English language reader, it points out that because most English readers don't know the phrase Bilad Sham, they don't understand what Greater Syria it is that the implications of what happened at Damascus were wider than simply the politics of what we call Syria today. Okay, so on one hand, I opted in that way. On the other hand, I know that today, Arab is being used to exclude non-Arabs in Syria, particularly Kurds and Assyrians, right? But I tried to make it clear in the book that that was not the spirit in which Arab was being used by Faisal and the people of the Congress, right? That I did check, there's a good amount of research now being done and published by Kurds from Turkey. Mm-hmm. And they have the demographic maps. And the Kurdish population in northeastern Syria today was not present in Syria at that time. It came later because of Ataturk's repression, right? And most of the Kurds were Arabized Kurds, the ones in Damascus. But more to the point, right? Faisal used the term as an umbrella to unify because that was the language that Paris could understand. He understood that Poles got Poland only by arguing that we're all Polish here. That Czechs got and Czechs and Slavs got Czechoslovakia because they could show that they were brothers and they could be one nation. And so he had to use that language in many ways. The second reason he had to emphasize the word Arab had nothing to do with excluding people of other ethnicities in the Middle East, but to distinguish Syrians and Arabs from Turks, because one of the main ways that the French fought against Syrian independence at Paris was to claim that Faisal was a descendant of the Prophet and that he would establish a theocracy, a government based on religion, and that he would wage jihad just as the Ottoman Turks had done in World War I. And what did the Ottoman Turks do? Another chapter of history that has been erased and forgotten in Syria. I can't find mention of it hardly at all in any Arabic language Syrian histories, much less English language ones, is that right next door occurred the Armenian Genocide.
Yeah.
And it was very easy to discredit all Muslims at that time as being Christian killers. And that played well to the very conservative religious Christians in Europe, if you will, certainly in Britain and certainly in France. So in ways that maybe I suspect Faisal did not even anticipate, he had to emphasize that all Muslims are not the same. Muslim is not a race, and we can talk about that. I'm very interested in the sort of use of racial categories to exclude people from rights at Paris, right? And so therefore Muslims are not, for Faisal, if Muslims are not a race, then all Muslims are not programmed by their DNA to kill non-Muslims. Do you see what I'm saying? He wrote so many letters back to his brother Zayd, who was holding down the fort, so to speak, in Damascus, right? Saying, oh my God, these people in Europe, they don't know anything about who we are. They have the most hostile image of who we are. We have to be careful to look at the use of the language in the historical context. Although I understand and I take your point that a current reader would see Syrian Arab Congress perhaps as something problematic today and not necessarily historically appropriate. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you very much. And that explains also the kind of the fashion of the period that was nation state was the game, right? So everyone had to have nation state. I struggle a lot myself when having to find a name for that period. This is even when we announced the centenary, we didn't know what to say. Centenary of writing constitution where? If we say Syria, people would think modern day Syria. If we say greater Syria, some people would think I'm Syrian nationalist and I want to claim all of greater Syria.
Right.
Levant, people think, oh, you're kind of Orientalist. If you say Bilad al-Sham, you think you're a traditional Arab historian. It's so difficult to find. If you also use Middle East, many people have issues with the term of Middle East. So
of course,
it is
a highly politicized term. We do have to make your piece. So I think you're right. Had you been at the conference with my publisher as we were finalizing the title, maybe I would have, made a different decision. As I tell my students, history is a very creative, profession, and you have to make these decisions of this sort. You asked a question about the distribution of power and other, and whether the cleavage between liberal and Islam, if I understood you correctly, was the enduring legacy of this. The reason I highlighted it in the book was because because of what I said at the beginning. I started the book in that summer of 2013, where both by then in Syria certainly and now in Egypt, it was quite clear that religious groups commanded a popular base that many liberals did not, and that liberals have become a kind of elite since the 1920s in these countries. And I needed to capture that. I think it is a fundamental and decades-old misunderstanding, if you will, or division that I see as truly a problem. I mean, even though they share an antipathy to tyranny, right? They don't, there are forces on the extreme ends of both parties that will pull them apart. And so for me, I thought, we need to repair that. We need, and a historian can help show. I mean, for me, they make arguments that to be democratic, you must be secular. They make polarized arguments, right? That is essential. They make a cultural and intellectual argument. I want to say, no, look at history. This is just a historical, artifact created by people, and it can be unmade. If it's made, it can be unmade, right? It is not essential. It's not necessary. So that is the reason I privileged that. The other thing I wanted to pick up on that I thought was very important that you mentioned in your introduction is that this story privileges the heroism of civilians, in civil society, not that of soldiers. Popular history in the United States and in the Middle East alike privileges stories about great generals and battles and so on, right? And we forget that we have had heroes that came before us. Those who fight for civil rights in my own country, in the United States, every time they have a demonstration, I go here in Washington, D.C., right? We have a lot of them. They say, hey, look, we still have to carry on the struggle. Don't lose heart. We stand on the shoulders of the great heroes who fought for civil rights before us. And, you know, in popular history, people don't know about those civilian heroes. They don't understand that their battle is part of a longer war. And I'm hoping that telling this story will give encouragement to those who might feel despair today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the answers. Now I'm going to open the floor for questions from the audience. And we have the first one from Aziz Hallaj. Aziz, I just approved you to speak, so you should be able to turn your mic on now. And if you want your video, let's see. Aziz, can you hear me? Let's just wait a second. I think I give approval. Adnan, if you're here, can you help me with that? I give approval to Aziz, but I can't see him. Until he makes a show, I'm going to get you some of the written questions. So we have the first one we have from Ayma Al-Jayush.
Okay.
She asks, do you think the average Syrian understand democracy, understand democratic institutions under these complicated circumstances, politically and culturally? Also, do you think the concept of citizenship being partners and respect equality by having the same rights and responsibilities has been crystallized nowadays?
Well, we would have to answer that, we would have to do a very good poll among Syrians, which is rather impossible at the moment to do, to know what aspects of democracy and what, you know, on any kind of nuance people may or may. And I believe it is true that years of dictatorship can undercut and certain values and ideas and practices. But I believe from what we saw very early in 2011 and earlier, there were earlier events in 2001 and so on. Syrian human rights groups claiming rights suggest that many Syrians do still hold those values. I don't think that any dictatorship can fully erase them. But it is the job, maybe the first and most important job of historians, to help preserve the memory of what came before, right? So, yeah, I'll just...
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, we have Walid Addas also requested to speak. I just approved that. Let's see if we're gonna see him. Walid, are you here? Let me just see if I can. I think we have to ask Adnan, who's now managing everything in the background, maybe to make the approvals himself. It looks like when I'm approving people, they're being disconnected. So please, yeah, try again. I'm going to take more of the written questions in the meantime. So we have another question from Taqwa bin Abu Bakr, says, what is the best method to analyze the relation between the corruption and the revolution in the Arab Springs?
Oh boy, that is well beyond my field of research, so I'm going to duck that question. Certainly corruption existed even at the time of 1920. It's a perennial thing. I don't think it's a new thing. You know, even Rashid Ridda, when Faisal first invited him to come to Damascus and become his advisor in the spring of 1920, expressed a little skepticism, saying, you know, you've been away, you know, you need to get better, right? It's very difficult. It's very difficult, but it requires persistence to reach that it has broken down. And so in I would say the same thing. There's no quick fix, but I don't see, you know, I don't want to comment on current events in Syria. That's really not my expertise.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Now I have a question also from Marcus and Yufi, who says he would like if you can elaborate more on how the French laid the foundation for dictatorship in Syria.
Oh boy, yeah. Well, that's an easy one. Okay, so the conquering or the occupation was a man named General Gouraud, who had served in French colonial empire in Africa and Morocco before that. He was a great hero of the World War I, but there was not a democratic bone in that man's body. Okay, even I think towards the French. The French have their own right wing, and in the 1890s, under the Third Republic, many of the people on the right drifted into the army and the foreign service. Okay, so but nonetheless, he knew that he had to. The only way France could stay in Syria was with a maximum deployment of the French military by military repression. Okay, so ironically, within weeks of the vote by the League of Nations to ratify the mandate in July 1922, he resigned. Why? Because the French Parliament cut his military budget. All right, he said, "I can't rule here. I won't." He knew that there was still 2 years after Maysalun enough resistance within Syria that without his maximum deployment, the French presence in Syria would be challenged. Okay, so every aspect of government in Syria was devoted to security. Historians have written books and articles about the imperial or colonial surveillance state. Mm-hmm. Back in the 1920s, or under the Ottomans, this was not the case, but by the late 1920s, 1930s, under the French, you go to a public clinic run by the Department of Public Health, your information is rooted into the security apparatus, the security, right? That had not been the case. In which the French laid the basis for a dictatorship. So that there were Syrians, a generation of Syrians who grew up under that kind of regime and would learn the lessons of rule under that regime and replicate them at independence in the late 1940s.
Great. Thank you very much. Now, I was trying to approve Aziz Halash to speak. It didn't work. I think he's with us now. Aziz, maybe can you speak now? Are you able to read your question to us?
She is speaking now.
Okay, there is a bit of delay, so 1 second.
Hello?
Okay, I think it's better if he maybe type. I think the voice connection is not working, so if people type the question, that would be best. No, I have a second question from Mazen Ghariba. Just 1 minute. Yeah, hi, Aziz, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, Professor Thompson, can you hear now? Can you hear Aziz?
Yes.
Okay, so do you want to introduce your question, please?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. It was a very enlightening presentation. I've been actually trying to get a copy of the book, but because of Corona, the orders on Amazon were not likely to be forthcoming these days. So I'm pretty sure there's a lot more details to the book than was presented in the presentation today. But what I would like to elaborate is perhaps if we can discuss a little bit the things leading to the 1919 event, in the sense that the Ottoman governance and constitutional process and where it went, the negotiations on decentralization back in 1913 in Paris. I think it's very important to understand also the electoral system that brought the deputies into that room and the different electoral process that made the selection, because in a way the participants in the Congress were brought in using the old Ottoman election law, which had provisions for ensuring that different minorities were there and in a sense different constituencies from different parts of big cities, small cities, etc. So in a sense, we're not dealing with something that's sprung out of the blue.
Right.
There was a history that led into that process.
Yes.
And this is my first question. In a sense, if we can go back a little bit and trace the initial secularizing elements that were happening since 1908 moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Second question, I think it's important to understand Rashid Rida's compromise in the constitutional writing process a little bit more, because the key question was primarily to understand also that there were major demonstrations on the street outside of that building when people were sending petitions from all over the place against the voting of women. And his argument that he made at the time was that, yes, women probably should vote, but we should also not send the message that we are an unlegitimate or illegitimate assembly, because France will use these demonstrations against us to point to everybody out in the process that we are obviously not very legitimate. People are demonstrating against us out there, and therefore we should tabulate the whole issue. So the environment is quite a bit complex in many ways, and he was, as you rightly said, trying to be a political realist and putting the primary objectives first. But primary objectives aside, the clash between the secularists and the conservatives in many ways was going to happen. Mm-hmm. In a sense, they all had an interest in warding off the French from coming into Syria, but beyond that, they didn't agree on many things. So it would be also important to speculate on that historic moment primarily as a moment where it was a marriage of convenience, not a marriage of conviction, to a certain extent.
Yes.
I have some other issues to ask, but one very quick question. The French have always made claim that the constitutional text itself never existed, and that it only survives through a French translation. And there's a whole debacle about is there an original text or not, and whether the Arabic text we have in our hand today is the original text or not. Can you elaborate on that, please, as well? Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you so much. Oh, those are great questions. It's such a pleasure to get such interesting and important comments from someone who knows the material so well. I'll go backwards and I'll address your last question about the text of the Constitution and the French claim that it never existed. Well, the French did all their best to destroy what existed, but we have clear evidence that the French had a copy of the Arabic translation, text of July 5th, not July 19th, in August of 1920 at Beirut, because we know exactly who translated it. It was a man named Louis Mercier. And we know that he purposely mistranslated that Article 1, right? The French had always claimed that Faisal was going to establish a theocracy that would harm the Christians, particularly those on Mount Lebanon, right? And so very conveniently, Louis Mercier translated Article 1 to read that the religion of the state would be Islam, not the king, right? And so, yes, I combed through how many French archives looking for, where is that copy that Louis Mercier had? And I could not find it. My last slender hope, and I actually just spoke a couple of weeks ago with the grandnephew of Faisal, okay, who claims he's in line to be heir to the throne of Syria and Iraq, a former High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, right? Who said, well, perhaps it exists in Amman somewhere, locked in a royal archive. We don't know. The man who published the Arabic text, and a text that comes from later, from July 19th, was Hassan Hakim, who was who later became an official, a minister in Amman. So it is quite plausible that he had a copy of that constitution there, right? So I'm hoping. But nonetheless, I was lucky enough, and I say it in a footnote, to have contacted Khairia Qasmi, who wrote a book some years ago on the period of the Congress. Her student, Mari Shahrastan, wrote a very nice book on the Congress in Arabic as well. And Khairia had said she considered the Hassan Hakim version definitive, okay? So it was on the faith and the transmission from one historian to another that I published an English translation of the Constitution. On your second point about Rida and the compromises, you're exactly right? That he was extremely worried that those mobs outside the chambers in Marge Square might disrupt the Congress. And you're exactly right that this was a marriage of convenience. And that's why, in the sort of technical language of historians, we could refer to this as a historical conjuncture, the alignment of stars at a particular moment where it can or cannot happen. I would argue that every constitutional convention is that. Certainly in the United States, where we're dealing with Black Lives Matter right now, right, we are dealing with the particular constellation that allowed Southern plantation owners, slave owners like Thomas Jefferson, to come and sit in a room and cut deals with Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, people from the northern states who are against slavery. All right. Any constitution is. And the way I expressed it in the book was to appeal to the recent work of a political scientist who was studying the recent attempts at constitution writing in Iraq after the American invasion. Right. And he argued the constitutions that are fought over passionately and finally signed are in fact much stronger than constitutions that are imposed from above by a few technocrats who have not been elected. All right. So on that faith, I believe that, that Syrian constitution would have been ratified, but it would have been as contested and debated as the American Constitution or anybody else's constitution was, and that there were always going to be opposing interests. But that is the essence of democracy. So I stand by it. Finally, on the past, absolutely. Had I another hour to give you a lecture, I would talk about it. But I'll say this, though. What particularly impresses me about what happened in Damascus in 1920 is that Syrians and Arabs chose to go back and to recapture what they felt they lost after 1908, right? That they had embraced that constitutional government, particularly with the revisions in 1909 in Istanbul. Rashid Rida himself traveled to Istanbul in support of the constitutional revolution, right? In so many countries after World War I, people turned their back on democratic liberalism. You look at the new states that were set up in Eastern Europe, none were as democratic as the Syrian state in 1920. Certainly, if you look at what happened in Turkey, right, the choice was to build a homogeneous state under a strong leader who would claim to represent the will of all those people. And instead, Syrians chose democracy.
Thank you very much, Professor Thompson. We have Walid Addas here with us, who would like also to put a question. So Walid, the mic is with you.
Yes, hello. I thank you both ladies for this. I have just a little comment on, about this Congress of 1920, which I think was a very good start that was disabled by foreign powers. However, I grew up in Syria in the 50s, and that was shortly after the French left. And to tell you the truth, I look at those days with great nostalgia nowadays. When I look and find out and compare to what happened afterwards, and when I look at Syria in the 60s, how it started deteriorating, and at Egypt in the past 5 or 6 or 7 decades. I wonder if any start of a Congress at that time should have been postponed for 20 or 30 years even, and letting the French and the British stay for maybe even 50 years in the Middle East to prevent adventurers like Saddam, like Assad, like those leaders who are just adventurers who had to bring back the country maybe centuries behind. I wonder if Dr. Thompson and Reem, you both agree with me or don't on this maybe extremist view. I hope it's not too extreme. But what do you ladies think? Do you share my view?
I will answer briefly, but I think Reem might have even more than me to say. Number one, I went to Egypt in 2011 and 2013. I interviewed a lot of people who were in Tahrir Square, and they too, like you, felt, weren't things better under King Farouk and the British? And, they prevented the army and the military dictatorship, and we want to go back to those days, right? Sadly, my own research, I've written a chapter on Syria in the 50s in my other book, Justice Interrupted, in particular a profile of Akram Hourani. I believe that he represented a generation that, because of certain circumstances at that time, made some poor choices, but were inspired by the democratic ideals of 1920, no question, okay? But I look at the circumstances of the Cold War, what my own country under Eisenhower did in threatening one coup after another and endangering the sovereignty of Syria. And I see those as more important in undermining democracy, right, than the presence of the military within Syria itself. The military was empowered by the threats coming from outside in the conditions of the Cold War, right? So I would not have expected that democracy would have ever taken root had France stayed. I think the French were not ever going to allow democracy in Syria. But Reem, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. I have to disagree with you. I think what the Congress of 1920 proved, and later on in 1928 and 1950, is that every time the people in the region, not just the Syrians, again, I mean, remember the 1920 was from the entire region. People were coming from Jerusalem, from Tripoli, from Beirut. What it proved is that when people of the region are given the opportunity to produce their own system of governance through a process, not a bottom-up process, like truly, not top-down process, a bottom-up process. Because remember, they were elected, and they came to the Congress. When you read the deliberation, you read the confidence they have because they were elected. They spoke with so much power and authority because they felt they are representative. They were not appointed by Russia or America or France. They were elected. And what we've seen is that when they are given this opportunity, they are no different to any other people on the planet. They have the ability to sit, resolve their issues to go together, build the alliances such as the religious conservative one that was built back then. It was not, let's remember, that alliance was not built by two party leaders deciding they want to come together and build an alliance. No, that was built through a process. Elections, debates, agreeing a mutual text together, and then, they wanted to enact it, it didn't work. So it's that process that we need to use democracy. We don't want something to land on us from the top. We are all amazed by the 1920 Congress experience. You should wait until you read the 1928, which I'm now writing about. It's the most amazing debates and discussion in a Congress, again, that was elected. And they had in the 1928 discussions, which were very democratic, and you could read also, because you asked me about the view of the French ruling, I would refer to their views. all of those who were elected from all over Syria to write a constitution in 1928, they had this strong anti-French sentiment. And they were like, fine, we accept the current reality, but let's organize the relationship between us and France. Let's reach an agreement. But we want our independence. We want to be sovereign. Most importantly, they felt so much power and confidence because they were elected to the limit that there was a debate once, and one of them said, "I don't want to say. I'm going to refrain from voicing my view on this issue." And they stood up to this representative and said, "Hold on, no one has this power, and we should have it in our bylaws that no one has the power to keep his view to himself. You're elected to represent the others, not to keep quiet in this Congress." This is what we need now. We need a new process where people who are representative to write a constitution for Syria. Now, we don't have the right condition for this now. We may need something interim, something temporary that help create these conditions to kickstart. It's not gonna start overnight. We need to kickstart a democratic transition in Syria.
Thank you, Reem. I appreciate it. I don't think we disagree on the necessity of the Congress that took place in 1920. I'm just basing my opinion on a supposed crystal ball in which I would see what happens to these Arab countries in the 60s and 70s. Obviously, that crystal ball doesn't exist anyway. So, but however, I am for that Congress, and I agree with Dr. Thompson that the independence was stolen by colonialist powers. However, what we saw was much, much worse. You know, you would be horrified looking at the 60s, 70s, and Libya, Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, and some more Arab countries, which really deteriorated into dictatorships and eventually these destructive wars in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon. I hope not. But that other Arab countries will take decades probably to stay on the right track. Thank you both, ladies. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Now we have many other questions. I'm going to start choosing, unless you have plenty of time. So one of the questions we have from Hazim, the Bush says, "Do you think the U.S. would have mandated Syria if they didn't withdraw from the League of Nations?" I'm going to give you another question at the same time, so save some time. We have a question from Hassan Abbas. And he's asking you about what role you think was the project that existed back then of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, which was southern Syria back then. What role did it play in the agreement between the colonial powers to prevent the establishment of independent, sovereign, democratic Syria? He adds that he thinks that there was an important role that was played, which was not mentioned in the lecture.
Good. Okay. Wow. Okay. I'll take the questions in order. Hazem, thank you for your question. That is a great question. I will answer it two ways. One, given the historiography today, the way people have written the history of the moment in English about the U.S. and Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, many of them would answer no Americans would ever have accepted a mandate, right? On the other hand, there's another history. Once you start looking at American history from the point of view of Damascus, right, you start seeing different things, right? You start asking different questions. And for me, it's quite remarkable that when Wilson went on a tour of the United States in September 1919, right, after the American Commission had visited Damascus, huge crowds came out in support of his vision of world peace, of the League of Nations, and a role that the United States might play in such a league to prevent or to ease or limit colonialism. Many Americans were against the European colonial empires, and they did not want themselves to become a colonial empire. Okay. And that granted, there are British and there were French people as well who were opposed to their colonial empire. So, right. So I don't know. You know, if history had been different, if Wilson had not had a stroke, right? If Wilson had played his cards a little bit differently, it's quite possible. You know, many people say Wilson became very rigid and narrow-minded and hostile after he had his stroke. I am just reading, apropos of our pandemic today, a book about the 1919 flu, which argues it's when he got the flu in April of 1919 that he started losing his touch mentally as a politician. So we can never know, right? Probably, though, the U.S. would never have done so because the sentiment, the United States did not have, and this is its virtue, compelling economic interests in the Middle East yet, right? Why were Britain and France there? Because they ran short of oil in World War I, and they needed oil because they knew they were going to fight another war with the Germans, okay? But the U.S., like everywhere else, was suffering after the war, and probably they would not have. There was a longer discussion about whether the U.S. should have a mandate for Armenia, right? There was an idea of creating a state of Armenia in part of what is Turkey today. Hassan Abbas, you have a question about the Jewish state and the role it played. I'm not quite sure what role. I guess I'd love to ask you what you see as a role that it played. Certainly, it became an excuse for British imperialists like Lord Balfour to say, oh, we can't change our mind, right? And it became a convenient rhetorical tool to say, oh, if we let Damascus become independent, it will endanger our Jewish homeland that we set up. But I don't see a large direct role of Zionists themselves at this moment in 1920, intervening directly in the future of the state of Damascus. But perhaps you have seen something that I have not seen in the historical record.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a few more questions. Do you still have time to answer?
Sure. I can, maybe we can go for 10, 15 minutes more. Is that good?
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much. So we have a question from Jusaima Moaid Pergurina, who says, what are we to learn from this event for designing and producing democratic results in the today's UN-led Constitutional Committee of Syria? Mm-hmm. A second question is from Mazen Ghariba, who, by the way, happens to be a member of that Constitutional Committee.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So Mazen is
talking to each other here. Okay.
So Mazen is asking, he said, in your presentation, you've discussed the historic origin of the acute polarization between the secular and the conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain the polarization that occurred within post-Ottoman Islamic movements in Syria? For example, the defection of Mustafa Sibai from the Ulama Council led by Al-Qassab.
Oh boy. Okay, good. These are great questions. And as a historian, I don't like to speak outside of the area where I've actually done my research too much. I've written in former books a little bit on the 1930s and a little bit on later Syrian politics. So I will, put parentheses around my comments right here and make provisional suggestions. Number one, just to look back and see that it is possible to make deals amongst different groups and not get 100% of what your interest group seeks, I think is a good lesson. All right. Just to learn that it was not the failure of Syrians to establish democracy, but it was the intervention of outsiders is an important lesson, right? It is, because the story had been told for decades since 1920. Oh, well, Syrians were not capable of governing themselves. Here we have explicit proof that they were absolutely capable, right? There's nothing wrong with Syrian culture, okay? So I think at its most fundamental, history can help us understand what are the important things to pay attention to and what are not. And culture is not your obstacle in establishing a democracy. and writing a democratic constitution in Syria today by any stretch. Now, on the acute polarization, that is a great question. I think a lot more research has to be done than we have done so far on the politics of what I called in my first book, the Islamic populist movements in the 20s and 30s, and on the sort of the rival divisions and schisms. Qassab was an old school teacher guy who spent a long time in Arabia, right, in exile after 1920. Very different culture from Sibai, and not. My first guess, without having done the research, is that they were able to organize rival groups around rival personalities there, right? It would not, as you know, until the 1940s that Sibai would unite many of those groups. But in terms of polarization with the secular liberals at the time, I don't want to overstate it. And if I have given the impression in my talk today that as of July 25th, 1920, Syrians were hopelessly divided between religious conservatives and secular liberal modernists, I'm sorry, because that's not the impression I want to give, right? I wanted to, in my final comments, suggest that the conditions that allowed for negotiation in 1920 were very difficult to reestablish later, but also the fact of repressive, violent foreign rule discredited religious democracy, liberal democracy in the eyes of ordinary people. To me, the striking thing is that Qassab was able to rally crowds in 1920 around essentially a democratic agenda, that it could be a popular movement. And that after occupation in the 20s and 30s, liberalism became a thing for elites only, and often in places like Egypt and Syria and Lebanon, elites who actually allied with the occupying power, and that the popular support went to groups that would, oppose those liberal elites, whether they be on the left, socialists or communists, or on the right, Islamists, right? They captured, much as, in some ways, when I'm writing this book, I found resonances to what's happening in my own country right now, where there is a sort of popular religious fundamentalism, that is as much fired up by the fact that those people live in parts of the country that have not prospered as much as the coasts where sort of more secular, left-leaning Democrats live, right? And so, it just reminds me of how much more research we need to do in Syria in the 1920s and 30s, but before we can actually understand the with nuance how the cleavage, I think it just widens over time, okay? But by 1950, certainly, when Sibai is able to insert clauses into that constitution at the 11th hour, right, that establish Islam as, an important pillar of of rule, you see a very difficult gap between the two sides already by 1950, and it would only widen further.
Thank you very much. We have Mr. Abbas with us here. Mr. Abbas, are you able to speak now?
I think so. Did you hear me?
Yes,
we can. Yes.
Great. Yeah. What I meant, Dr. Thompson, imagine that this project, it's not the project, imagine that democratic, like great Syria,
mm-hmm.
In the natural or geographic Syria, Bilad al-Sham. So imagine that a democratic state were established.
Okay.
So, and wouldn't that make it very, very difficult to Great Britain to establish Israel, a Jewish state in Palestine? Because I think this project would be way more difficult with a democratic Syria, democratic state of Syria present. And secondly, the legitimacy. How would Britain justify the establishment of such a state in Palestine, which was a part of Syria at that time, where in Damascus, a democratic government, a democratic state are like established. So that's why I think this the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine was a priority for Great Britain at that time. And I think that has played a big role that Britain and France have these agreement or reached these agreements that, okay, the France can occupy Syria, North Syria, and destroy the new democratic land at that time. So, and I think many people in the West, I live in Germany, are not educated enough about this issue. Like in West Europe, in the United States, many people don't understand that. And like some people think, like here in Germany, for example, that the establishment of Israel was like some sort of a reaction of the Holocaust, which is nonsense.
Right. Yeah.
Huh? So I would like to ask you, what do you think about this?
Yeah.
So
that's true. That's true. Thank you so much. And it's an issue that deserves treatment on its own. Even I chose to leave out so much in this book and just focus on what the politics happening in Damascus was, that I could not tell in full detail the story that you rightfully bring to the fore right here, right now. Two things on that. If we're going to engage in counterfactuals, and that is a cardinal sin for historians, we're not supposed to do that, right? And if I want to roll back, say to the summer of 1919, at the time that the American Commission is there, and we want to imagine that the King Crane Commission returned to Paris and everybody said, oh my goodness, Syrians want democracy and independence. We'll give it to them, okay? We will imagine, right? As of that moment, right, there were secret and controversial understandings between Faisal and Chaim Weizmann, right, of the Zionists, about, we'll support each other in securing our future. Right? And Faisal had insisted, I will not recognize any homeland. And remember, homeland was not state yet in 1919, right? I won't recognize any homeland unless Syria gets independence. Okay, so Syria has its independence, and we might imagine that Faisal would then have said, well, okay, but hey, there are lots of non-Jews living. You look at Isaac Darwazeh from Nablus and Sheikh Murad from Gaza and so on, we're going to have to work out something. Well, we might imagine that, if Britain had already in the summer of 1919 said, okay, Syria can have its independence, right? That you could theoretically imagine that the British would let Faisal and Chaim Weizmann work it out. I don't know, right? But we're getting into such a realm of imagination. What I as a historian insist on is to look for the agency and the intersection of forces at that moment. And as of the summer of 1919, the Zionists were not interfering in the politics up in Damascus, right? Certainly, they took quite note that there were many Palestinian Arabs who claimed to be part of southern Syria in Damascus, right? They would have noticed that. And certainly the British, who wanted a larger British footprint in the Arab East, mainly because of the oil, we know, okay? But would have used the so-called threat to the Jewish homeland, right, to push back against. That is all there. But to really get at the causation and say, at that moment, did Zionists subvert Syrian independence? Not clear to me. Anybody who has read David Fromkin's book, A Peace to End All Peace, Have you read that one, Abbas? You must be familiar with it. It's an old favorite from, 30 years ago now. Shows that the British themselves were so fractured. There were so many factions within the British administration that the outcome was not, foreordained, right? But certainly there were the most powerful voice for British colonization came not on the part of those who wanted to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but the India office that wanted control of Iraq, right? And he also shows us that by 1922, the British Parliament and the British public lost all interest at all in Palestine. They didn't want to pay for it anymore, right? So many things could have shifted in that story. But I cannot personally make an argument that Zionists acted directly to subvert the Syrian state before July 1920.
Great. Thank you very much again, Professor Thompson. I think now we're over time, so I have to apologize to many of the people who put questions that there wasn't enough time to go through them all. I'm very sorry, but there were so many comments in the chat that I didn't convey to you about how excellent this presentation was and how they all enjoyed it. So thank you so much for your time and indeed for an amazing book, an amazing episode of our history that you unveiled. I would like to thank our audience again, and I just shared here with you in the chat box our new website, SyrianConstitution.org, or you can go to distور.org, and there you will find the link to Chapter 14 of Professor Thompson's book, and also you'll find the link to some of our publications on this topic, and there you will find also future announcement to our upcoming event. As I said, this is not a one-off webinar. This is part of a series of events that are going to come between now and December to celebrate the centenary of trying to build a democratic state in the Middle East. One of our upcoming activities is going to be the publishing a book in Arabic and a summary, like about 25-page summary of it in English and Arabic about the Constitutional Court. And that was written by Dr. Brahim Derraji, who's a member of this project. And this is, again, an extremely important topic in the development of democracy, often ignored. He wrote a great book on the importance of the Constitutional Court and how it developed. The debate about it also developed between 1920 until now. We're going to send you an emails when we get this out. Finally, I would like to thank our partner in disseminating and publishing this webinar, which is Status or Al-Wada, which is an audio Arab journal, not just an Arabic, English journal, about Arabic and Middle East topics by the Arab Institute and Jadaliya Journal. So thank you very much for helping us in disseminating all the publicity about the webinar, and for if you're interested in reading, in listening to this webinar again, you will find it at the website of Status Al-Wada, and we're also going to publish it in our website very soon. Thank you again very much. Thank you, Professor Thompson.
Thank you. My pleasure.
See you in future event. Thank you.
Thank you so much.